But now we get to the more intervention-focused part here. So if the 2016 presidential election caused an increase in anxiety and fear, then the question is, if this were to occur tomorrow or the next day, how might we manage these things differently? And so I'm going to be using a dialectical behavioral therapy approach to focus on changing negative emotions. It's an empirically supported treatment for personality disorder. Again, that's my area of focus, but it's been applied to other things as well. It's designed specifically to try to change your negative emotions when you feel like they don't fit the facts or when they're not going to be effective to dwell on. And I'll add to not fitting the facts, also if the intensity isn't fitting the facts. It's okay to be feeling a particular way about something, but if it feels so intense, beyond really what it should feel, then these techniques might be useful to manage those negative emotions. So it starts with the idea that we're all existing with some vulnerabilities in our life, and that can make us more prone to experience negative emotions. That then leads to a certain event that occurs, no matter what it is. We interpret it, and there are some styles of interpretation that can make things worse for us. That then leads to our reaction, our urge, and then our acting on things that then quickly spiral to the next event. And this system goes pretty quickly, through and through. But if we can take a step back and really try to unpack it, we might get a better understanding of how we can manage our internal emotions. So again, this is somewhat informed by the DBT approach. One thing we could think about is to try to manage our existing vulnerabilities. So if tomorrow is going to be the election, and if maybe the next day is when you find out whether or not your candidate won or lost, the research has told us that sleep might be difficult that night, so maybe getting a good night's sleep tonight will be an antidote. I don't know if you all remember the Snickers commercials, "You're not you and you're hungry." Yeah, so if you know it's going to be a rough day for you the day or day after, why not get a good meal in yourself so that you don't feel like you're going to already be stressed because of that level of hunger inside. I'll point out to spread out stressors. There's no rule that says you have to have a really difficult conversation with your boss the day after the election where you're already feeling upset and now you're going in trying to be effective to try to manage something. If you can, try to spread out the things that are going to be hard to do across a week or a week and a half so that you don't feel like you're doing a whole lot of things in one particular day, because that can increase your stress level. You can then add positive events to your life to try to balance out some of these more negative experiences if you feel a negative experience from the election. And then also finding ways to build your competence. That one's going to be less relevant, but to the extent you feel less competent, that could be an antidote. The prompting event will either be your candidate will lose or your candidate will win. We'll know on Wednesday. As well as perhaps prompting events, which is to have conversations with families and friends, some of whom agree with you, some of whom might not agree with you. But then we get into this idea of interpretation. And the goal of talking about interpretation is to try to remove the inaccuracies so that we're left with a reasonable way to understand the facts. And so these are all predicated on the things we can do to kind of distort reality and then make our emotions more intense because of those distortions. So one example is overgeneralizing. For instance, the belief that, well, if this person wins, therefore this outcome will happen. And that might be true, but we want to be careful against, for guarding against this idea that just because one thing occurs, the other thing absolutely has to happen. We should think about all the steps that go in between to try to manage those reactions because, again, it can make us feel more emotionally intense. Another version of overgeneralizing as well, because that friend of mine voted for person X, that means they agree with everything that that person says. Of course not, right? You vote for people that you don't agree with 100% of their positions, and so we have to assume that other people do as well. In fact, the hostile attribution bias says not only do they agree with their positions, but they're doing it on purpose to make people suffer. I'm telling you, no one wants to say that I'm trying to make people suffer. Okay, maybe I'll treat an antisocial person who will say that to me, but for the most part, most people just have a difference of opinions, a difference in values, but they don't really willfully try to hurt other people. And I think it's important to remember that when we're having conversations because it can bring us into a better sense of balance and accuracy. Finally, mental filter is the idea, like, you know, during political conversations where we kind of focus on the things that we disagree on and maybe the most worst implications of those disagreements, and doing so intensifies our negative emotion. It reminds me of treating body dysmorphic disorder. This is a disorder characterized by I have a small defect in my appearance, let's say the way that my beard looks, and so I spend an hour looking in the mirror to try to perfect that small defect in my beard. Right? Of course, that's not true. I think my beard looks awesome. But the treatment for body dysmorphic disorder is to do attentional retraining, where you have the person stand in front of the mirror and look at every part of their body for an equal amount of time. It models for them that you could spend an equal amount of time evaluating yourself as a whole person rather than fixating on one thing. So I think within political conversations, we could also do that. we can take a step back and rather than just focusing on the most negative, disagreeable parts of the argument, take a step back and see how the entire perspective is being discussed. In fact, even try to challenge yourself to find values that you share with that person, even if you disagree with the answer they arrive at in terms of how to enact those values. So then we get to the reaction. So to this point, I've been talking about ways to change things, and yet all we're trying to do is remove the imprecisions of you understanding and processing things. But when we get to the point of experiencing, you can't avoid the experience of having a reaction when the election occurs or when anything occurs. It's like walking outside today. If it's raining and it hits your skin, you're going to feel the sensation on your skin. It's nonsense for me to say, but don't feel like it's raining, because it's raining, right? It's a sensation. Feelings are the same way. There are sensations that we can't avoid. Again, we can change the way that we're interpreting things to maybe not make them more intense than they need to be. And yet, when things don't go wrong, it sucks and it feels bad, and it's okay to have those experiences. It's important to validate those things and to avoid judging the reactions that you have. Emotions lead to urges, and urges are okay. We don't need to avoid them. We don't need to judge ourselves for having them. So I get into this conversation, this person's frustrating me, I feel like punching them in the face. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not going to do it. Urges aren't behavior, right? Oftentimes, especially in this therapy, people act on their urges too quickly, and so they falsely think, oh, well, the problem is I just shouldn't have emotions. I just shouldn't have urges. No, having urges is fine. If you can distinguish between what is an urge to do something and what is the behavior. In fact, building that distance between those two can really teach you a lot about empowering yourself to have more complex reactions and allow yourself to feel them. If you can get that distance, then you can interpret these urges to try to understand them. Now, I've talked to 3 different people today. Why is it that I wanted to punch that dude in the face? Oh, right, he was being arrogant about it and he wasn't listening to my perspective. Okay, so now I know about myself. It's important to feel heard in these conversations even when I disagree. So we're using our inner reactions to help us learn about ourselves as a vehicle for self-exploration, which is cut off if we act on things and then feel like the whole system is something that's to be avoided. Instead, what I'm arguing for is reduce vulnerabilities and check your interpretations, but have the reaction and be open to the idea of what urges might come. What behavior should you act in? Well, if you're managing these things effectively, you can act in line with your values. One of the ways that you could enact that would be to vote. Of course, voting tomorrow is an important thing. This approach also talks about opposite action, and this is designed when your feelings don't fit the facts or whether too intense for the facts that actually exist. For instance, when you're angry, the urge, the so common human urge, is to attack or to disagree or to get into an argument. And yet that's often not productive emotionally and then doesn't get you to a place where you're really learning from the other person. So instead, could we be kind to them? In that moment where we want to shout towards them, could we listen? Could we try to adopt a perspective of caring about what they say? And if we do that, it will regulate our emotion. I'm not saying to do it for their sake. That doesn't matter at this point. But it's about regulating our own emotion. And so that's one of the techniques to use. So we talked about anger. One of the other ones is fear, right? The instinct when you have fear is to escape and to isolate. And yet if you isolate yourself after the events that occur, you start to have all these interpretations about how people think towards you, and you never test them because you're isolating yourself. And it sets up what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy, where we're not really getting into the idea of testing, do people really think that of us? So by instead doing the opposite of that action, by engaging people who you think will share your values, you can have a conversation that might bring you out of that sense of feeling isolated, feeling fearful, feeling marginalized. And finally, sometimes your people win. And what do you want to do? You have the emotion of excitement. The urge, perhaps, is to share it with other people, to spike the football, to talk about how great it is, to talk about all of these assumptions, these overgeneralizing things that are occurring. In that moment, instead, if you could take a minute to sit with what it might feel like to be on the other side of that. What would it feel like to go up to that person and say, hey, I know you really value this, and I really value that, and it sucks when your person loses. To really get a sense of empathy for the other side, it might actually really spur an interesting conversation that you wouldn't have otherwise had by just saying, oh, that's awesome, my side won. Of course, all this connects back to prompting events, and you'll have to decide for yourself how much you want to have political conversations in the next couple of days. This approach tends to say there's no one correct answer. There might, in fact, be some really good reasons to avoid political conversations in the next couple of days. Right? Short term, it can reduce your anxiety and stress. it might be effective for you because you might make situations worse. Like if your boss disagrees with you and like you got to go in and you're feeling like you're going to tell him off, like your emotions are going to be guiding what you're going to say, maybe that's the moment to take a step back and to not do that. There might be, again, spreading out stress. Why to have that difficult conversation right now? If you know you're going to call up your parents and they're just going to rub it in, then don't do it. Give them a couple of days and then process them afterwards. Now, in the short term, that's pretty effective. In the long term, that ultimately doesn't get you where you probably want to be. And so there's a lot of good reasons for engaging in some of these political discussions. If it's with people who share your values, like we talked about before, it makes you feel understood and heard, which are very good things. But even with people who don't share your values, there's a lot of important lessons. First is that you can do it and tolerate it. I think there's maybe this untested assumption that it's going to be too difficult to have these conversations, but if you do them a couple of times, you find that it's actually something you can do, and you feel less like you have to avoid those topics. Second, you might learn that some of the interpretations you made about the other side are inaccurate, that actually they don't believe all of those things. They only believe some of those things, and they believe it for this reason, which I hadn't thought about because I only watched the one channel that I look for, and I don't see that other side of things. And finally, and probably most importantly, talking to other people who disagree with you is an important vehicle to explore what you really believe. Because if you believe something, and the only reason why you believe it is because no one's challenged you on it, then why even hold on to the belief, right? If it hasn't been challenged, and if you think it gets challenged, it goes away, then it's not really a truth anyway. So having these difficult conversations can really help you to grow and learn as a person. I don't think you can often change other people's minds, but if you approach it by trying to learn within yourself, it could be productive.